Hi, I'm Ian and welcome to Muffin Reviews. The purpose of this series is to look at vintage and modern games, what the differences are, just to review one game at a time, go through some history behind them, if you want to play them, if they're still available, where you can get hold of them, how you might go about, and what are the essential books that you need. The number of editions that games like Dungeons and Dragons and RuneQuest and Call of Cthulhu and a number of these role-playing games of certain age go through can be quite daunting to someone to get into it, especially with the availability of products from old editions of these games, especially through sites like DriveThruRPG and the current nostalgia that's going on in republishing old versions of games and old editions. So with that in mind, I'm going to try and guide you through one game at a time. So that being said, we're going to start with a bit of low-hanging fruit and go through the what's known as nowadays as basic Dungeons and Dragons, or also known as the BX edition, and also known as the BECMI edition. You'll see all of that and where all that comes from as we go through a little bit of the history. So the basics of Dungeons and Dragons, it was originally published in 1974 by a company called TSR, and it relied heavily on the assumed player base, which would be wargamers that are stepping into it. It started with a fantasy supplement for the war game Chainmail, and when the original game was released, it still relied on Chainmail. It was assumed that you had a copy of Chainmail to handle combat situations and so on. So it really started as an expansion for a fantasy supplement for a war game, and it was assumed that a certain level of war game knowledge would be had by players. That wasn't really necessarily the case, especially as the game gained in popularity, and it really did gain in popularity. So there was a time in the late mid-70s, in 1977, where TSR decided that they needed an introduction into Dungeons and Dragons. At this time, they were one of the authors of Dungeons and Dragons, Gary Gygax, was working on a revision of the rules. There was two real problems with the original rules from a standpoint of some players. The first was they were quite difficult for non-war gamers or people that weren't in the know of that particular genre of game, of what it was all about and how it was meant to be played. And for a second, the game, as originally envisaged, was very, very open plan, very here's a set of guidelines that you can build your own narratives, games upon. So that being said, they decided that they needed an introductory set of rules to get people new to the concept of role-playing games, very new in those days, and also fix down the rules as they were, so that to enable tournament play and a more sort of established fixed set of rules, a common set of rules as people playing it at tournaments and conventions. So the tournament and convention route, the standard rule set by which people turning up randomly on a table at a convention would be familiar with, that was Gary Gygax's remit in 1977, and he started out on the road to write Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And a guy called J. Eric Holmes, he picked up the mantle of trying to write an introductory game to it, and that became Dungeons and Dragons, the basic set to Dungeons and Dragons. This is a silver anniversary reproduction of the rules that Holmes wrote. They're really quite simple, 48 pages long, really nothing to them at all, and they cover the basics of the game. They go up to level 3 across a handful of classes. Not very difficult to pick up at all. The problem with this version, this edition of the rules, was that Holmes and Gygax weren't really in communication with each other as to the direction they were taking the game in. So although this served as an introduction pretty well to the original 1974 game and certain of its supplements, it didn't serve as a very good introduction to Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. So by the time this was out, 1977, and the final Dungeon Master's Guide for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons was released in 1979, you had an issue where you had a basic introductory Dungeons & Dragons set of rules that people were picking up and saying, oh, this is the introduction game to this, and then picking up Advanced Dungeons & Dragons and finding that there was so much different in it. So many of the core mechanics were slightly different, but different enough to really throw people for a loop. So various reasons then, following this, they decided to revise Dungeons & Dragons, but this time, instead of trying to make it an introductory game into, for a start, the original 1974 edition of Dungeons & Dragons was no longer being published. So instead of trying to make it an introductory into that, and instead of trying to make it introductory into Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, what they would do instead is make it into its own game. And there were legal issues as well that we won't go into here. I'm not going to jump down legal rabbit holes in this series at all. But the issue was they needed to keep Dungeons & Dragons in print. Advanced Dungeons & Dragons was its own thing. They decided to make Dungeons & Dragons its own thing too. So in 1981 they revised the rules to come up with the basic set of rules. This again, it built on this, introduced levels 1 through 3. For those that aren't familiar with the way that levels work in role-playing games, it's a power level. The more experience that you get doing whatever you do, then the better you get at things, and that's represented by a level. And what they did was, on the back of that, they published expert rules. So you had a basic set of rules that went up to levels 1 to 3, introduced the game, taught you a few principles of it, and then once you mastered this and you were ready to go to the next level of it, you moved up to the expert rules. They continue on. They're not a game in and of themselves. They continue on from the basic rules, but they go all the way to level 14 and start introducing more complex modes of play, like instead of a rigid dungeon environment where things were very controlled and your characters go in, kick a door down, beat a monster up, get treasure or so on. It started introducing the idea of a fantasy setting in which the players lived, other ideas of interaction with characters, with non-player characters, and the wilderness adventures as well, where the characters would roam around in the woods and the moors and whatever, in a more free and open basis to it. So rather than the rigidly controlled environment of a dungeon, they would expand things out. So the expert rules expanded on the basic rules and introduced those more advanced concepts. And that was in 1981, and the basic rules promise the expert book. There's a nice little paragraph here. It says, okay, the expert book is going to give you rules from 4th to 14th level of play and wilderness thing, and then the D&D companion set provides further details for player character classes from the 15th to the 36th level of experience. Now that companion set that this particular edition talks about never came. What happened instead was that in 1983, so that edition of the game only was around for a couple of years. So in 1983, TSR went through a brand overhaul. They redid all of the covers for the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons game, re-established the logos, so the logos for the games started being a bit more towards the modern Dungeons and Dragons logos that you might have seen today, with the ampersand being in the form of a dragon and so on. They updated some of the layouts that they would use, the page layouts in the rule books and so on. And the basic Dungeons and Dragons game got that treatment. So instead of just recovering the edition here, what they actually did was to rewrite, take the opportunity to learn everything that they had over the last couple of years and some of the things that have been written in adventures and magazines and so on, and rewrite some of the rules, tweak certain bits, and start releasing a series, an established series of rule sets. The first one, basic Dungeons and Dragons, again stuck with that format, with the basic rule set covering from levels 1 to 3. And that came out in 1983. So there's not a huge amount of difference between the 1981 edition and the 1983 edition, other than formatting and some of the rules got tweaked. But the main difference was they split the rules up into 2 booklets. So you had a Dungeon Master's book, and you also had a Player's book. So all of the things that the players needed to know, spells, character classes and so on, were in one book, and then all of the procedures that Dungeon Masters needed to know, referees, where you had monsters and how to run encounters and how to calculate points for killing monsters and gathering treasure and so on. They were all in the Dungeon Master's book, so they had that separation. The expert rule set in that line built again, taking the expert rules from the 1981 edition, building on that and releasing that in a newly formatted box set that carried on directly from the basic set. So in 1983 you got the basic and expert rules all nicely reformatted, the new logos and the new livery and the new paintings, and that was how it was. Again, there was a promise in there of a companion set, but now also it mentioned a master set. Obviously in the 1991 editions the companion set was promised but never happened. But in this edition the promise was made good, and along in 1984 came the companion rules, not going from 15 to 36 as had previously been promised in the 1981 basic rules, but this time going from 15 to 25. And they introduced all sorts of concepts. They introduced players establishing their own strongholds and running their little domains, and just pushed the game on a bit further. And then on the promise of the master rules, that indeed came along in 1985, the master rule set, that came on, dealt with levels from 26 to 36, giving you the full span of the 36 levels that had been promised right from the get-go in 1981, and that was the whole span of the game, 1 to 36 levels, with the game evolving as the players got up. And we'll deal with a bit more of that concept later on in this video. But what was hinted at but not specifically said, so the rules said we're going to have the basic and expert and the companion and the master rules, and they didn't go further than that, but there were hints here and there in the companion rulebook and in the master rulebook. There were hints that there was something beyond the master rules, beyond 36 level. Maybe the characters may want to quest to gain immortality. And in 1986, the final box set of rules in that series was released, the Immortals box set. That was the capstone of that edition of the game. Your characters would go all the way from first level in the basic edition through the intermediate levels in the expert set, through to the higher levels in the companion, through the very high levels in the master set, and then eventually go on a quest to achieve immortality if they so chose that route. And the Immortals rules explained that, the quest for immortality, how that got together, and how characters could achieve it. But then what would happen after that as well. So the Immortals rules covered player characters being immortals with worshippers and so on. So that formed what's known as the BECMI edition. The initials there for Basic, Expert, Companion, Master and Immortal. BECMI. Now in 1991 what they did was to get rid of all the box sets, all the multiple box sets, and boil it down to 2 releases. The first was a big black box containing maps and cardboard figures and dice and a rule book that would go up to level 3, I believe, or maybe 5. It's been a long time since I looked at that set of rules, but the lower levels it would use, and it came in a big black box, and it was called the New and Easy to Master Dungeons and Dragons game. Very much a learning tool. One of the innovations that they added there that would help learn the game was a set of large, let's say big, index cards with the rules on them, categorized by dragon color. So white being the weakest dragons gave you the easiest rules, and learn those rules first, and you could move on to the second most weakest dragon or whatever. It just gave a nice little learning tool that took you by the hand through the game rules, so the basics of the game rules. In tandem to that, they collected all of the BECMI rules, other than the Immortals rules, so all the way up to Master, into the Rules Cyclopedia. So this contains all of the rules that will take you from 1st to 36th level in the basic D&D game. What it didn't do, as well as the Immortals, but it didn't teach you how to play the game. The assumption was that you would go into picking up the black box basic set of rules, play through that, learn how to play the game from that, and then once you were ready to go on, you would get this book, which would give you all of the rest of the rules, including the rules in the box. Not really a teaching tool. There is a lot of content in this book. It even introduced you to the default world of Dungeons and Dragons, which is different from any of the ones that were being published for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And it started off as an example little area in the basic and expert rule books, and then eventually became a published world in its own right. And there were numerous supplements released for that over the course of the entire history of the game. So that section in the back of that rulebook just introduces that game. So it's basically got all of the rules from 1st to 36th level, plus a bit on the world, and the default world. Not that you had to use the default world. Plenty of ideas in there to take you on your own world. And in the early days of Dungeons and Dragons, that was the expected modus of play. Seems a bit these days that the expected mode of play is that you play one of the canon official published worlds that has come out for various editions of the game. But back in the early days, there were no published games, published worlds, and the assumption very much was that you use these rules to create the game that you want to play, to create the world that you want to play. So that's its history up to it being seen as a serious game, a product that was being supported, that was running in parallel to Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. If you consider that Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, the first material for that was coming out in '77. The Holmes Basic book also was published in 1977, so the foundations of both Dungeons and Dragons and Advanced Dungeons and Dragons came around in 1977. The support for the game dropped off. It was almost like the Rules Cyclopedia was the last capstone of the whole line. It was like, here you go, here's all of the rules in one book, and that's kind of, we'll park that game from now on. There were some supplements that came out and some additional bits and pieces. So the Immortals rules were revised and were released in a campaign box, which gave you an adventure outline and so on, called Wrath of the Immortals. And there were some campaign supplements released for the known world after that. It was quiet on the actual gaming front. Most people were playing Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. It was kind of seen as the redhead child of the two of them. I think that the legal side of it, where they had to continue to publish it, and they had to support it in some way, probably balked a lot. But it had its fans, and I was one of them. It is one of the nicest additions to get on with. But its final gasp really came in 1994. So in 94, the publication of the Rules Cyclopedia ended. Pretty much all support for the Dungeons and Dragons game as its own thing ended. Mystara had shifted over to being an Advanced Dungeons and Dragons world campaign setting, moving even its default example world across to its sister game. And you had a box set that dealt with a limited number of levels. It boiled down the rule set into a single 128-page book, gave you some other materials, plonked them all in a box, shoved the box out. I don't think a lot of care was taken into that box set. Just when I've looked at it, there's no inspiration there. This book I love as a resource and as a game set of rules. Very well done. The box set, the 1994 box set, which came under the title the classic Dungeons and Dragons game, was, I think, a half-hearted attempt. I don't think a lot of effort went into that game, and it really does show. So to me, this is the final capstone of the game. The classic Dungeons and Dragons game box set from 1994 is it's really sort of the last gasp of a company that doing something that it has to do, doesn't really want to do, so it just pushes any old tat out the door and be does with it. So that wasn't around for very long at all, and obviously after that, Wizards of the Coast bought TSR in 1997. Following on from that, Wizards wrote the third edition of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons and pushed that out the door in 2000, dropping the Advanced, and that was the only edition of Dungeons and Dragons to exist thereafter. So all of the editions from third to fifth now have carried the Dungeons and Dragons name. There's been no separation and no separate game books. So really, the demise of Dungeons and Dragons, in terms of the basic rules, BX, BECMI, whatever you want to call it, that sort of happened in 1991, and then 1994 was its death rattle, and by 1997, with the takeover from Wizards, it was over. So how does it play? Well, if you're familiar with a lot of role-playing games, you may see some attempt at realism, some attempt at complexities and so on. Advanced Dungeons and Dragons is certainly a complex game. Every edition from 2000 on of the Dungeons and Dragons game had its complexities there. I think a lot of the complexities is built in terms of the number of options presented to you as a player and as a dungeon master to world building, to character races and classes and how they work. Dungeons and Dragons stood for the 1974 version of Dungeons and Dragons, with the original game. You had pretty much 3 classes and then a couple of races, 3 races. So you had fighting man, cleric, and magic user. It's a very limited number of characters to play. I know the thief wasn't in the original game. Then the dwarf and elf, they were derivations of that. Very much wargaming type statistics with the advancement progress there. The number of levels that you went up with wasn't a huge number of levels. The spell choices weren't vast. And then it built on in the supplements and so on. But the core rules behind it, they didn't change away from this is an abstract game that's, once you get your head around it, it's quite easy to play. It's quite easy to play on the fly, which I think is quite important for a narrative game like a role-playing game. If you've set out a nice plan, a nice skeleton narrative of the situation that's going on that you want the players to sort out, and the players, as they frequently do, decide that they want to go off in a completely different direction, then the 74 version of the rules is open, simple and flexible enough to be able to pick that up and work with it on the fly, to just ad hoc make it up as you're going along. And that was inherited by the basic Dungeons and Dragons, not so much by Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Advanced Dungeons and Dragons required a lot more codification of what you were doing, of encounters and so on, and that's been true of every edition on that line to modern day, where encounters have to be constructed, they have to be balanced, they do have to have certain mechanical elements built into them, and certainly a raft of statistics in order to make them work. That's not to say that you can't play any of those games ad hoc. We played AD&D ad hoc in quite a spectacular way on times, and we continue to play 5th edition in an ad hoc basis as well. So it can be done, it's just a little harder, and you do have to ignore a fair bit of the advice that they give you in terms of encounter building and so on. You know, like, this is how encounter building should be done, and if you're playing in an ad hoc way, you kind of ignore that. This didn't really go into the basic rules, didn't really go into encounter building. They did give you advice on how to construct adventures, but they weren't really into this whole idea where the characters move from encounter to encounter or from scene to scene. What they were more into is presenting players with problems, and then leaving the players to sort through those problems on their own, and actually figure out the solutions to those problems. Even if they came up with solutions that the DM hadn't considered, there was flexibility in the rules, and the rules were simple enough to be able to fly with it. So that's kind of the basic scope behind basic Dungeons and Dragons. It is a flexible, abstract game that allows you to tell those narratives as a group and not be so rigid and structured as to make you think twice. Not inhibit, but make it. It made it easy to play in an ad hoc manner, whereas some of the later editions, modern editions of D&D, have made it harder for you to play in an ad hoc manner. So the actual gameplay itself, creating a character, very simple. You take 3 6-sided dice, roll them, sum up the values on the dice. That gives you the value for an ability score, and you would do that 6 times. So you would generate a score for strength, intelligence, wisdom, dexterity, constitution, and charisma. Some players of later editions will be familiar with those ability scores, but not necessarily the order. The order changed in the mid 1980s, but certainly Dungeons and Dragons used that sort of classic strength, intelligence, wisdom, dexterity, constitution, and charisma order for a long time. And you did those in order. So you rolled your strength, and you rolled your intelligence, and you rolled your wisdom, and so on. So you did all six ability scores, and then from there you decided what type of character you wanted to play. So you may If you had a high strength, you might want to play a fighter maybe. If you had a high intelligence, you might want to usher yourself down in the role of magic user. And whichever direction that you decided to go, there was nothing to stop you from going, my strength is really horrible, but I'm going to play a fighter anyway. You could be that bloody minded if you wanted to be, but in general, you picked the best score that you were, the best score that you'd rolled, and went with it to whichever direction that took you. So it wasn't so much a pick your class and your race and then try and arrange and generate your scores that would fit into that mold. It was very much a roll the scores and then see what classes you can fit to those scores. There was another rule that allowed you to adjust your scores around by lowering one of your rolled scores to raise another rolled score. So there was another bit of jiggering around, so you could try and go in a direction of the character that you wanted to play within the limitation of the scores you'd rolled. But that was generally that. Now the classes that you have in the game, you have fighter, cleric, magic user, thief, dwarf, elf, halfling, and in the BECMI version of the game, you also have mystic. And that's it. That's all the character classes. Some of the additional material introduced other character classes as well. It's one of the reasons why the game is so easy and ad hoc. You're not trying to juggle, oh, this guy's a dwarf but he's also a fighter or whatever. It does make things like dwarves and so on a bit narrow. If all dwarves are going to have these abilities, none of them are going to start chucking spells at you. The dwarf cleric did turn up in one of the campaign books, but generally speaking, all dwarves were pretty much the same. All elves were pretty much the same. All fighters were pretty much the same. What you did with them was different in each one. So they all had their own personalities, and it's what you made of that counted, not what was on the paper. So because these classes, other than what the ability scores fed into them, because these classes were so similar, one fighter from another, DM could quite easily just invent some stats on the fly. This is where all the ad hoc play bit comes in. Invent some stats on the fly. There's the NPC fighter that they happen to be on over here because they've gone completely off anything that the DM mapped. But he can make those fighter stats up in his head. He doesn't need to look through a stack of rule books in order to work out what that actually might mean, or generate any extensive statistics for that particular character and his abilities. He just needed to know that it was a 5th level fighter and this is what a 5th level fighter could do. It lent itself to that. Combat, it's Dungeons & Dragons. It uses the abstract. So armor class, your defensive capabilities are abstracted down into armor class and hit points. Armor class went from, 9 is your unarmored, down to 3, which is plate. And for those familiar with later editions, yes, armor class went down. For those familiar with the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons line, it's like, yes, unarmored is 9 in basic Dungeons & Dragons, not 10. One of those small differences that can make the world of trying to translate between the two just a bit of a pain. Not impossible, not particularly hard, but definitely a pain. The smaller changes are, the smaller differences are, then the harder they are to spot and keep them going. So by the end of the BECMI line, armor class went from 19 down to -20, which is a bit OTT. It needed those armor classes in order to cover some of the greater challenges and the big powerful stuff that gods might get involved in, and the various penalties and things that could be forced on a character's armor class. So an attacker would roll a 20-sided dice. They would cross-reference their class and their level and the armor class of their opponent on a table. That gave them a number that they needed to roll equal or over turn in order to successfully strike their opponent, and off they went. They rolled their 20-sided dice. You all looked at these tables here, and if you succeeded, then you hit. Roll damage, damage on a various shape of number of sides of dice according to what kind of weapon you were using, and that got lifted off, taken off your opponent's hit points. So really abstracted down. It did include some optional rules for manoeuvres, so you could do set spears, you could parry, you could attempt to disarm your opponent. These were done in a relatively easy way, mainly over the abstract that we're talking about there. So you always boiled down to a 20-sided dice roll in order to attack, and then in order for that attack to do something. Usually it was you attack to try and do damage, but beyond that, with a maneuver, you could attack to try and do something else. And that is pretty much it. Or to resist the effects of various magical and special attacks, you would have saving throws. Now, players of the modern game may be familiar with either reflex, fortitude, and will saves, or in the current game, a saving throw for every single ability score, so strength saving throws and so on. But in Dungeons and Dragons, what you had was a saving throw by category. So you had a saving throw against spells, and a saving throw against petrification, and a saving throw against poison. And that all varied by class. So some classes were better at saving against some effects than others. Spells are really simple in their definitions, split between magic user and cleric as well, but you really only had a few characteristics of spells. They were really broad and again abstracted, but there were a very limited number of spells. If you look in, that's the entire magic user spell list. If you look in some of the editions now, there are lots of spells and more spells coming out all the time. That's a good thing for variety, a bad thing for trying to reference everything on the fly. In basic Dungeons and Dragons, they really just said, here's a set of spells, and these are really the only spells that you'll probably need to go wandering down into a dungeon to kill stuff. It did get a little bit more complicated. The Master Rules introduced weapon mastery, which obviously are in here as well. Weapon mastery is a nice idea. The idea behind it is, as characters go up in level, they can focus their fighting training on a certain number of on specific weapons, and from those specific weapons they can start doing really wacky things, like throwing longswords around like as if you're Hawk the Slayer. Go and look the movie up if you've not seen that before and you don't know what I mean. Just more and more advanced things. The weapon mastery is fine, but the table that covers special abilities is a little bit eye-watering and has a heavy use of symbology, which is, it's okay if you keep track of what you're doing with it and remember that you can do certain things with certain weapons, but it does add that element that slows down, breaks out from the abstract and simple into a bit more of the complex and specific. And then when play got into the level of companion, you had the whole set of rules for establishing a domain and a stronghold and how to run it, and the amount of taxation that you can put on the minions that live on your land and so on, and to defend it, should you need to defend it from an army. It included rules for mass combat with the war machine rules. So yeah, a lot of the game evolves as you play. From the first level. First level is very much about go down the dungeon, kill the monsters, steal the treasure, successfully complete the mission that you've been assigned by some mysterious person or whoever. As you get through to expert level, that 4 to 14 block, then you are starting to get involved in more complex plots and more things that involve the broader stage of the world. Go out into the wilderness, hunting things down, getting your first taste of what it means to fight a dragon on open territory instead of in a 20 by 20 block cubic room. Then when you get to companion level, the game changes again. Still elements of it remain the same. There's no reason why you can't play the go into a dungeon and kick the door down and steal the treasure at companion level. Just that the monsters are a lot stronger, and the expected rewards and what's behind it are just that much more elevated. The companion set of rules is more about your characters getting involved on the political stage and doing things there, establishing their own domain, defending that domain, and running it. Then when you get into the master level, you're talking about truly heroic epics on the scale of Hercules, heading on to the Immortals rules, where they go on their quest to achieve immortality, do so, achieve immortality, and then it's about getting involved in the intrigues of the other immortals, and managing their worshippers and their temples and so on. So the game, in terms of BCMI, the game changes over time as you go up and higher and higher levels. So as a general review of basic D&D, I can say that the original rules, as it started out in 1977, those rules, even though meant for a beginning audience, they have still got that twinges of being written by someone that understands them, that has already played, that understands how the 1974 edition works. And so there are teaching elements in there, but it's not that clearly laid out as to how you're going. By 1981, they'd fixed that. The BX books, these little things here, they had really sorted it out. They're very solid books, very good starter game, especially in terms of leading you into the game, teaching how to play it, giving you an understanding of what the core theme of the game, what you're meant to do with it. I mean, a lot of times in role-playing games, if you give a role-playing game to someone that's never seen one before, never touched one before, only familiar with board games, Monopoly and whatever, and you put a role-playing game in front of them, quite often they'll look at you absolutely confused and say, what am I meant to do with this? The basic Dungeons and Dragons rules, the BX books, really do help with that. If you read those through and follow it through, they do give you a nice understanding of how the game works and how to play it. As for the BCMI stuff, this is, like I said earlier, this is one of my favourite role-playing game rule books. A brilliant example of how you can get a really good game into a single volume, and have it absolutely solid from start to finish. but it doesn't teach you how to play the game. If you tried to learn from this, yes, you would get there, but you would get there with a lot of battling. And if you gave this to a newcomer to role-playing games, they would be lost with it in very short order. This really only works if you've gone through some of the basic set first. It doesn't matter which basic set you've gone through. Even the 77 version will get you up to speed enough to be able to understand what this book is doing. The 81 one will certainly get you there. The 83 one will get you there quicker because this uses pretty much the same layout and format as that book does, so you'll be familiar with the format of how the rules are laid out by the time you get to this book. The 91 easy to learn adventure game version, that was written specifically to lead you into this game, so that's probably the best version of the game that you can pick up, basic version of the game that will lead you into the how the Rules Cyclopedia works and the extended rules in there. The pros of the game, like I kept saying, is the fact that it is so basic, so abstract, so easy to manage. There's no difficult numbers, no difficult stats. Everything is pared down to what you need in order to play that particular monster or whatever. There's not. I mean, now you get full pages of stats for monsters. In a Rules Cyclopedia, what do you get? You get one page, and I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 14 separate monster entries on a 2-page spread. So the statistical element of the game is kept to just what is needed at the bare bones in order to make a fun game. Character stats are really easy to understand. Character sheet, all you need is a single page. So all we've got there is all the stats you need on one page. There's no huge amount of stats on it, so that the page isn't cluttered. There's not like any tiny writing anywhere. There's nothing really difficult there, and just on the back with your equipment and so on. So that kind of gives you an example about how easy all the statistical side of things is. So the monster stats are easy, spell stats are easy, character stats are easy. It is simple just to go for it. So that's the major pro of it. The major con, I feel, is that the game is a heroic fantasy game up until you start getting to the companion set. Now, the companion rules, although they cover management of strongholds and building strongholds and that side of things, the power creep in the characters from 15th level and upwards is very, very marked. And by the time they got to Masters rules, you're not talking about heroic fantasy characters anymore. Through the course of the companion and the Master rules, you've pretty much transitioned into a superhero game. Some of the abilities, and particularly things like a number of hit points, number of the effectiveness of attacks, and so on, that where you get beyond a certain level, you've got a single fighter facing off against a dragon. Now, you're no longer in the realms of swords and sorcery or heroic fantasy. You've definitely moved away from that. Part of that is intentional. When you get to master level of play, it really is in terms of you're not in terms of Conan and Grey Mouse or anything like that anymore. You are in terms of Hercules and some of the Thor and whatever, as you're transitioning up to becoming pretty much gods. So there is that the power creep is intentional. It's just, if you want to play a superhero game, then my general opinion would be you'd be better off picking up a superhero game and playing that, rather than playing a game that at some point transitions into a superhero game. So your magic user or your fighter or whatever that has been doing magic user and fightery and whatever things and completing quests along the lines of Lord of the Rings or Conan or that level of fiction, and then suddenly you are knocking it back like a virtual Superman. It is a kind of double-edged sword, though, that most of the leveled role-playing games do break down after a certain point. They do make that transition from your character is a powerful but recognizable mortal, if you like, type of character up to a certain point. And then beyond that certain point, they are no longer recognizable as a hero. They're definitely gone into superheroes, and virtually every single game that uses levels has that issue. What the good thing about Dungeons & Dragons in terms of that is it recognizes that, and it does have that transition of change in the emphasis of the game as the characters go up in level. So we have that in the companion level, this is what you're doing. In the master's level, you are doing something else with all your pretty much superhero adventures, and you're trying to find the right quest to go on to achieve immortality and that side of it. The immortal side of it is a completely different game, so in and of itself. So it's difficult to review that at the same time as Dungeons & Dragons itself. I think it becomes not an extension to the game that you're playing, but it becomes a completely different game once you've made that jump from Masters into Immortals. But from basic through to expert, it's an absolute solid game. From beyond expert, from companion through to master, it's still a solid game. It's still enjoyable, but the very nature of the power wielded by the characters changes significantly into being unrecognizable in terms of heroic fantasy. And then Immortals is a separate game, pretty much unto itself. So that's mine. So yeah, if I was doing a star review, I would have to say that Dungeons & Dragons, Rules Cyclopedia of Dungeons & Dragons, is definitely, as I said, one of my favourite role-playing game rule books. The game itself, very solid 4 out of 5. The BX, again, it is another of my absolute favourite. And again, I would say this is a solid 4 out of 5 as well. Probably 4.5, because of the omission, the unintentional omission of the companion rules that give you that superhero power creep level. So really the con side of it that I see as a con in the game is accidentally removed from the BX version of the game. So maybe that's worth an extra half point. So essentials, if you were going to try and play Dungeons & Dragons tomorrow, with this version of Dungeons & Dragons, what would you need? I would say first thing you need to do is to find a basic version of the game, either the 77 version or the 81 version or the 83 version, or even better, the 91 version, the easy to master game set. And then once you've played that, and I do suggest that when you play, you pick up module B2 as well to keep on the Borderlands. This works well. It was included in the basic rule set from 1979 through to the 1983 versions, and there's a reason that it was included. It's one of the best teaching modules out there. There's enough scope and variety in it to try out all sorts of different ways of playing. There's enough spaces in it for you to start stretching your imagination as a dungeon master, and there's enough variety in there for players to try different things and find their feet within the game. So a copy of one of the basic rule sets plus Keep on the Borderlands, and that will get you started, and that's all you need. When it comes to getting beyond the basic set, then the no-brainer is go and pick up the Rules Cyclopedia. Now, if you're only interested in going through the BX stage of things, you could go and buy the expert rulebook from the 81 version. So you could go and pick up that rulebook there. That will take you through to everything that I find good with the game. But if you wanted the full thing and you wanted an example of a world design, and you wanted as much information as you'll probably ever need with the game, then definitely pick up the Rules Cyclopedia. It won't teach you how to play the game, which is why I'm suggesting go through a basic version of the game first, and if that captures you, then pick this book up. Now, most editions of the game are available on Drive-Thru-RPG as PDFs. The good thing about the Rules Cyclopedia, that the time of this video, it's also available as a print on demand, which is nice because my original copy of that has through the 90s did the rounds a bit on the tournament stage. I did a lot of DMing for tournaments back in the day, and so having a nice clean copy that isn't battered and falling apart, and it's complete. Everything from including the world maps and world summary information is in there. Yeah, that's my suggestion for essentials. Some other materials, if you're not familiar with role-playing games, some other materials you'll need at least one 20-sided dice. You will need at least one 12-sided dice. You will need at least one 8-sided dice. You will need at least two 10-sided dice of different colours. You will need at least one 4-sided dice, and you will also need as many 6-sided dice as you can get hold of. 4 6-sided dice are a good number to go for. The only other thing you need there then is pencil and paper. You can write out character sheets on any old scratch piece of paper. You don't have to write them up on an official character sheet, but there are plenty of places where you can download character sheets for free and print them off if you so choose. And that is all you need to start playing basic Dungeons and Dragons. So just to summarise what we talked about, the Dungeons and Dragons game, as it stands, the basic D&D game, is probably the closest version of the game to the original 1974 edition of those editions that came after it. It kept many of the same concepts, many of the same abstractions, and a lot of the we'll leave this whole section open to interpretation, whereas other editions have actually tried to nail those the sections of the rules down and add complexity to them. D&D kept it basic, added in some some strange things like weapon mastery at the time. I don't think were absolutely necessary, but they do add a flavour to the game, and they make characters a little bit more specialised rather than cookie cutter. From a real point of view, the heritage of this game goes all the way back. It goes all the way back to 1974, and every single role-playing game and computer role-playing game, as well as tabletop game, owes so much to this game. Nearly every single aspect that you see in computer role-playing games and tabletop role-playing games now is either a reimagination, a re-engineering of a concept that was introduced in Dungeons and Dragons, or it is a reaction to something that people didn't like in Dungeons and Dragons. A lot of those have been reactions to the abstraction and the simple rule set that it produces. It's accused at times of being not very realistic, of being too abstract, of being too simple, not very good at portraying combat and so on. But I think the people that level those accusations at the game miss the point of the game. It's not trying to be a simulation. It's trying to be a fun game that you can sit down without thinking too hard, let your imagination stretch, instead of having to think of which particular rule book, a particular rule that someone has brought up is in. Instead of all of that, all the rules are pretty simple, pretty set out. You can easily make things up on the fly, and your imagination is not hampered by the rules. So I think that's for those that like statistics, that like the mechanics of things, then we'll certainly be reviewing games in future episodes that do that, that try and do things a little bit more real-world, realistic. But as a fantasy role-playing game that does swords and sorcery, that does heroic fantasy really, really well from a narrative point of view, then there are very few games that do that better than Dungeons and Dragons. I hope you've enjoyed my rambling about this. There will be other episodes in this series, so please let me know what you liked, what you didn't like, and we can try and improve later episodes. And actually, if you'd like me to review a game, then let me know. Bearing in mind that I will only be reviewing games that I have played and been involved with in one extent or another. So if you want to go and say, oh, can you review this abstract game that was on Kickstarter back in 2012, it's unlikely to make it onto my list. But games we will be covering will include other editions of Dungeons and Dragons and Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. We'll be picking up RuneQuest in its various guises, Call of Cthulhu, Traveller, and a few other games. Some of the games we might be reviewing may be somewhat obscure, but they'll be obscure in the sense of a gamer that came through the late 70s, 80s and 90s, and into the 2000s. But most of my very active gaming was done through the 80s and 90s. So that's generally the focus that you will get on this. So yeah, let me know in the comments below if you're interested in knowing when new episodes are posted. I'm going to try and do one a week, but they, as you can see, they're a bit lengthy, mainly because I'm a born again rambler. But yeah, let me know, subscribe, switch that bell on, whatever it does, and have a great week.